Right now, Kazakhstan has declared war on Russia, a stab in Putin's back. They've issued a hellish ultimatum. A powerful alliance with Ukraine is being prepared, something that's never happened before. The Kremlin turned pale when they heard about this. A financial apocalypse. The EU has unfrozen Putin's billions. All the money is going to strengthen the Ukrainian armed forces. 2 billion euros for deadly drones. Ukraine is preparing a decisive strike. Superweapons are about to be deployed, a stunning gift from the USA. This arsenal will wipe out the enemy. Top secret technologies are headed for Moscow. Putin is terrified. Catastrophe has torn Russia apart, and an entire city is simply suffocating. The Ukrainian armed forces struck a key target. These images are blowing up the internet. Chaos has engulfed Europe. A drone apocalypse has paralyzed Munich. Orban received a resounding slap at the EU summit, and the US shutdown is taking down Trump. An explosion at the White House. Nothing like this has ever happened before. It seems Donald will be removed. We covered all of this in our episode, Hotspot, a sensation. Kazakhstan has challenged Putin. This is a shock to Moscow. And Central Asia is slipping out from under Russia's influence. What does this mean for Ukraine? An unexpected military alliance and a blow to the Kremlin's imperial ambitions. This could turn the tide of the war. Why is Moscow already in a panic? All the details coming up.
President of Ukraine Zelensky, President of Kazakhstan, Tokayev, met in New York for the first time since 2019. On the sidelines of the assembly, Tokayev stated that it was time to sit down at the negotiating table, although he did not directly condemn Russia.
Kazakhstan, according to,
remains concerned about the crisis around Ukraine, which continues to inflict serious harm on civilians, undermine global trust, and weaken international security. Nevertheless, bilateral and international diplomatic efforts to resolve this conflict should continue.
Kazakhstan seems to maintain neutrality on the issue of the Russia-Ukraine war and offers its mediation services.
Kazakhstan initially offered its services as a possible mediator or as a venue for negotiations between the two opposing sides. This position has not changed.
But as they say, the devil is in the details. There are many details in Kazakhstan's relations with Russia and Ukraine. For example, Kazakhstan refused to cooperate with Moscow on building a nuclear power plant. China will build it instead. Also, according to Kazakh authorities, they are preventing Russia from circumventing Western sanctions.
Well, we are taking measures to ensure that our territory is not used to bypass these sanctions. Various comprehensive measures are currently being taken, including the meticulous tracking of goods, advanced online tracking systems for all shipments, and even the creation of a specialized user-friendly website where you can easily check whether a particular company or a specific product is officially listed on the sanctions list. This platform is known as traderadar.ca. I believe that all our diligent exporters are fully aware of these crucial regulations, and accordingly, they consistently comply with them in their operations.
And the president also stated that he does not recognize the legitimacy of the so-called LNR and DNR.
we do not officially recognize Taiwan, nor do we recognize Kosovo, nor the autonomous region of South Abkhazia, nor the disputed territory of South Ossetia, nor indeed Abkhazia itself. And apparently, this fundamental principle will be consistently applied to any state territory which, in our considered view, includes both Luhansk and Donetsk.
Naturally, Russian politicians and propagandists cannot tolerate such audacity and regularly threaten Kazakhstan with war, claiming the same thing as with Ukraine, that these are supposedly originally Russian territories. And
if we don't resolve the issue with Ukraine, then we'll have problems with Kazakhstan, with Armenia, and with other countries that surround us. Even with Kazakhstan, can you imagine? Well, of course. Why? Well, just look at what's happening in Kazakhstan today in terms of, so to speak, building a Kazakh state, the flourishing of national mythology there about independence, about switching to the Latin alphabet. There's a lot of interesting things going on there if you take a closer look.
The situation in Ukraine is clearly mirrored in Kazakhstan. There are also huge regions there populated by Russian speakers.
Some people in Kazakhstan believe that in the future, we want to take northern Kazakhstan from them according to the so-called Ukrainian scenario, as they put it. What do you think? Did we ever have such plans? Do we have any designs on that?
We have historical rights to that land. It's an industrial region. These are cities that were built by our ancestors. Why did we give them away in '91? On what basis?
Because of this, Kazakhstan created a list of Russian citizens who are banned from entering the country. This list includes about a dozen deputies of the Russian State Duma, as well as the notorious Tina Kandelaki, the ideologue of the Russian world Dugin, and the late husband of propagandist Simonyan.
Kazakhs, my dear brothers and sisters, what kind of profound ingratitude is this that you are displaying? I implore you to take a very careful and thorough look at the tragic situation unfolding in Ukraine and truly reflect upon it with utmost seriousness. If you genuinely believe that you can continue to be so cunning and sly in your actions, and that absolutely nothing negative will happen to you as a direct consequence of this behavior, then you are gravely and fundamentally mistaken in your assessment of the situation.
President Zelensky has repeatedly stated, citing intelligence data, that Russia has military plans for Kazakhstan.
So the crucial information we have received indicates that among their primary priorities are indeed the Baltic countries, along with Moldova and also Kazakhstan. These are the closest targets for the Russian Federation.
The president of Kazakhstan stated that he would suppress any attempts at separatism, while Kazakh deputies went further and made claims to territories that are part of Russia.
As responsible and conscientious citizens, we must resolutely oppose any and all manifestations of radicalism, extremism, and separatism, striving to be both delicate and at the same time firm in our approach. And ultimately, we must always endeavor to be fair and just in our judgments.
Yes, we need to understand that Novosibirsk, for example, is not Novosibirsk, it's Novy Sobor. These are our Kazakh territories. Tyumen is the southern region of the Golden Horde, which means that even beyond Tyumen, further north, those are also our territories. Orenburg, not Orenburg, but Ornborg. And at one time it was the capital of the Kazakh state.
There was also a lot of different information from intelligence, for example, that Putin demanded Tokayev supply weapons for the war with Ukraine, and after Ukrainian drone attacks on oil refineries, he begged Kazakhstan for gasoline. At the same time, Putin constantly humiliatingly mixes up Tokayev's first name and patronymic, and he probably does it on purpose. Everyone
knows that the president of Kazakhstan, Komijema Ilyich Tokayev, turned to the members of the Collective Security Treaty Organization for help.
So Komijema Ilyich was speaking, and dear Komijema Ilyich Kamilovich, it's good to see you again. So Kosom Jaman Kirillovich said that somewhere he has 27 billion.
Dear Komijema Ilyich Kosom Jaman Kirillovich, I hope this message finds you well.
Putin's plan was to draw Kazakhstan into the so-called Union State, following the example of Belarus, but he didn't succeed. Tokayev simply mocked such proposals.
Recently, the president of the Republic of Belarus, Alexander Ivanovich Lukashenko, suggested that Kazakhstan join the Union State. But I appreciate the joke for what it is. I don't think there's any need for this since there are other integration associations. First and foremost, we already have an economic union here. As for nuclear weapons, we don't need them.
Even those who seem to be Russia's closest allies understand that it's impossible to trust terrorists and murderers. That's why they need to be kept at a distance and, if possible, support those who oppose them.
The European Union drops a bombshell, 2 billion euros for Ukrainian drones. The first word from von der Leyen, the EU is turning Ukraine into a superpower in strike drones. The first line of defense against Putin is ready for hellish strikes. What drones will the Ukrainian armed forces receive? And why did the Kremlin erupt in outrage after hearing this? All the details coming up next.
Even more aid and support. The European Commission has agreed with Ukraine to allocate 2 billion euros for drone production. The funding is intended to help strengthen defense capabilities and develop high technologies that will also benefit the European Union.
If we still consider Ukraine to be our first line of defense, we must increase military assistance to Ukraine. That is why we have specifically agreed with Ukraine that a total of 2 billion euros will now be spent on drones. This allows Ukraine to scale up and utilize its full potential. And of course, this will also enable the EU to benefit from this technology.
Since the start of the full-scale war, Ukraine has ramped up weapons production and the implementation of new technologies, which are already being used on the front lines. The volume of domestic weapons production has increased many times over.
This points to an increase in the capabilities of Ukraine's defense forces, primarily in terms of striking military targets on the territory of the Russian Federation. Let me remind you, Earlier, Germany announced the allocation of 1.8 billion euros to the Ukrainian side for the production of strike drones and the manufacturing of Ukrainian ballistic missiles. In other words, EU countries continue to demonstrate unity when it comes to strengthening the defense capabilities of Ukraine's armed forces.
Ukraine is also negotiating a mega deal with the US worth $90 billion for the purchase of weapons. Kyiv has provided Washington with detailed documents outlining all military needs, including requests for long-range weapon systems. First of all,
an air defense system will be received. This refers to the Patriot surface-to-air missile systems. By the way, President Zelensky has already noted that the Israeli-supplied Patriot SAM system has been actively protecting Ukraine's airspace for a month now. In addition, the NASAMS air defense system, a joint American-Norwegian production, will also be supplied along with, first and foremost, means of destruction. This refers to systems with a tactical and technical range of 450 kilometers, and most importantly, their quantity, 3,300 units.
And while this deal is still at the negotiation stage, 6 NATO countries have financed 4 defense aid packages for Ukraine totaling more than $2 billion as part of the initiative listing Ukraine's priority requirements.
The order is being formed based on the needs of Ukraine's defense forces. In addition, this makes it possible to speed up the logistics of transferring American weapons directly to Ukraine's defense forces. This significantly increases the capabilities of Ukraine's defense forces in countering the Russian occupation troops at this moment.
Meanwhile, they have found a way to legally use Russia's frozen assets. The European Union is discussing the possibility of providing Ukraine with about 140 billion euros in the form of a so-called reparations loan. The EU proposes to allocate part of the money for the purchase of European weapons and another part to finance Ukraine's budgetary needs. However, not everyone agrees with such proposals. French President Emmanuel Macron is critical of these initiatives.
First of all, let me once again emphasize the absence of legal mechanisms for seizing frozen Russian assets. In other words, the European Commission said A but did not say B. This was a political statement, not supported from a legal standpoint. One should not make empty promises, fully understanding that there are no mechanisms for fulfilling them. That is, the statement by the European Commission should be regarded as nothing more than a political statement or as an element of political and economic pressure on the Russian Federation at the moment of ending the war in Ukraine. And Macron's statement indicates an understanding of these processes.
For its part, the United Kingdom has already spent more than £1 billion on supplying weapons and military support to Ukraine, using funds obtained from frozen Russian assets.
Europe is in panic. The drone apocalypse is spreading. Munich is paralyzed. Belgium is in shock. Drones over a military base. This is a Russian incursion. Scandal in Copenhagen. Orban received a resounding slap at the TES summit. The details blew up the internet. Shutdown in the USA. Military aid to Ukraine is hanging by a thread. Kyiv risks being left without weapons at a critical moment. All the latest events you might have missed coming up next.
Russian drones continue to terrorize NATO countries. This time, it's Germany. Munich airport was shut down for almost 7 hours because of unidentified drones.
Adin Aldemovich, why are you sending so many drones to Denmark? I won't do it anymore. Not anymore.
I won't.
I won't.
I won't do it anymore. Not in France, not in Denmark, not in Copenhagen. Where else is it flying to? All of Dedovik, all of Saibon, and somewhere else it's not flying.
In light of recent events, the Prime Minister of Poland stated that Russia is already waging war against Europe.
We
must put an end to such illusions. The first illusion was and still remains. It lies in the belief that there is no war. Some of us like to use terms such as full-scale aggression, incidents, or provocation. No, this is war. A new kind of war, very complex. But it is war.
Putin will push the Europeans, demonstrating their incapacity, showing their unpreparedness for such hybrid threats, so that they are not so active in defending Ukraine's interests.
At the same time, speaking at Valdai, Putin denied everything. He claimed Russia was not first, not attacking anyone, and that, on the contrary, Europe is preparing for war.
Honestly, I just want to say this. Calm down, sleep peacefully. Finally, take care of your own problems. Look at what's happening on the streets of European cities. But if someone still wants to challenge us militarily, as we say, to each their own, let them try. Russia has repeatedly proven that when there is a threat to our security, to the peace and tranquility of our citizens, to our sovereignty and even to our statehood itself, we respond swiftly. There is no need to provoke us.
Putin also responded to Trump's words about a paper tiger, stating that, as it turns out, all of NATO is fighting against Russia.
Everywhere, Russian troops are confidently, let me emphasize this, maintaining the strategic initiative. But if we are truly fighting the entire formidable NATO bloc and still consistently advancing, moving steadily forward, feeling absolutely confident, and that's merely a paper tiger, then what exactly does that make NATO itself? What profound significance does it truly represent then? But never mind that. The really most important thing is to always be very confident in our own selves, and we are truly confident.
It looked, if not pitiful, then at least not as convincing as he sometimes managed to be in the past, even if he could and did do it before.
And of course, there was the usual nonsense about traditional values. Putin called on Russians to wear kokoshniks in order to defeat the West.
Recently, someone told me that a Russian tradition is being revived among girls, young women, for various events, or when they're out relaxing, going to bars and so on, are showing up in kokoshniks and Russian costumes. You know, this is no joke and it really makes me happy. Why? Because it means that despite all attempts to undermine our Russian society from within, our opponents are achieving no results. In fact, the effect is the opposite of what they expected.
Meanwhile, in the US, the shutdown of the federal government continues, the so-called shutdown. According to unnamed officials, this could delay arms deliveries to Ukraine amid intensified Russian mass attacks.
But there is a very important and crucial nuance here. Specifically, critical sectors are not affected by the government shutdown. For example, issues of national security and defense are not impacted by the shutdown. Most of our significant agreements primarily concern unmanned aerial vehicles, more commonly known as drones, the vast military-industrial complex, and crucial intelligence data. So, in terms of the overall and comprehensive set of issues, these are specifically vital security and defense matters which are absolutely protected from the government shutdown in one way or another, ensuring their continued operation and importance.
It seems that Putin is truly desperate. He is losing, and on top of that, he has ruined the country for the sake of his bloody ambitions. And the usual attempts to hide failures behind hysteria, with typical threats to the West, no longer impress anyone.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now. Europe is unfreezing Putin's billions. The money is going straight into Ukraine's hands. The Kremlin's wallets are bursting at the seams, and the billions frozen in Europe are now working for the Ukrainian armed forces. How will this money turn the tide of the war? All the sensational details in our report.
The Kremlin's money could become a weapon against itself. For the first time in 3.5 years of full-scale war, the European Union is preparing to direct frozen Russian assets to support the Ukrainian army. If implemented, this step will be unprecedented in the history of international finance and warfare, turning billions of foreign funds into resources for Ukraine's defense. Until recently, the European Union debated whether these funds could be used without violating international law. But now the situation has changed. For example, Germany used to be one of the main opponents of radical measures.
Previously, the nation of Germany was quite critical of the idea of confiscating Russian assets, firmly believing that such an action would inevitably lead to numerous significant and negative consequences. Ukraine needs help, but preferably without confiscating these Russian assets.
Now Berlin is changing its position.
Berlin is open to new legally justified plans to use 172 billion euros of frozen Russian funds to support Ukraine's military efforts, which refers to the idea of the European Commission, a high-ranking German official told Politico.
The idea is that the funds are transferred to Ukraine, and in their place bonds backed by the European Union are issued. In this way, Brussels hopes to avoid direct accusations of confiscating Russian property. Essentially, the aggressor country's money is being replaced by Europe's IOUs. At the same time, negotiations are underway to provide Ukraine with a so-called reparations loan. Funds that Kyiv will only have to repay after Russia pays actual reparations. The final amount of the loan will be determined after the International Monetary Fund assesses Ukraine's financial needs for 2026 and 2027.
Ukraine is currently receiving this substantial reparations loan. There's even a specific and widely discussed figure mentioned, precisely 130 billion euros. But the crucial collateral for this significant and unprecedented loan will be specifically the frozen Russian sovereign assets that are currently held in a secure depository in Brussels, which are conservatively estimated at around 270 billion euros, a truly considerable sum that far exceeds the loan amount and provides ample security for this financial arrangement. This is a loan that will have to be repaid. And here there are two options, which is why it's called a reparations credit, a reparations loan. Either Russia pays reparations to Ukraine after the war ends, as compensation for the damage caused by the war it started. And then this loan will be repaid from those reparations.
If Russia refuses, then the loan will be repaid using the frozen assets.
This is a compromise, flexible option. That is precisely why Germany supports it. And in principle, I believe that this may currently be the most realistic option for using frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine. This compromise option also suits many European countries, including Germany, because it means they won't have to use their own budget funds to support Ukraine. Because if support for Ukraine is to be increased, and that's exactly what's being discussed now, then where will the money come from? If the money is taken from their own country's budgets, it would either mean a budget deficit and various financial problems, including inflation risks, or they would have to cut spending on other areas, including social programs, which would lead to electoral dissatisfaction. That is why this option of indirect, flexible use of Russian assets to support Ukraine is the optimal compromise, which I think will satisfy the majority of European countries at this time.
For now, this is a project that still needs to be agreed upon and approved by the European Parliament and, most importantly, by the EU Council, where the principle of consensus applies. And here, problems may arise with our so-called loyal friends, the Slovaks and the Hungarians.
There are two options here. Either joint pressure is applied, possibly with some compromises with Orban, because he also needs money. And sometimes, in exchange for certain agreements with the European Commission on subsidies or grants for Hungary, he is willing to make compromises. Maybe it will work out the same way here as well, we'll see. Or it may be necessary to find a solution that would allow this scheme to be implemented without the consensus principle.
In any case, the discussion about frozen Russian assets is reaching a new level. For the first time, European countries are talking about steps that would allow them to turn the aggressor's money into a resource for strengthening Ukraine's defense. If the plan is approved, Kyiv will receive a unique tool for financing military aid without directly burdening European budgets.
A decisive turning point in the war. The US is preparing a gift for Ukraine that could sweep Putin away. Ukrainian drones have broken into Russian territory. The enemy's air defense is shattered. A fiery apocalypse in Russia. Putin is in a panic. A ridiculous statement from the negotiators in China trying to reach an agreement with the UN, completely out of touch with the reality on the front lines. A new factor in Ukraine's favor could rewrite the course of the war. All the details in the report.
The largest chemical industry enterprise in Russia's Perm region, the Azot plant, where explosives are produced, is ablaze after an attack by friendly drones. Could it be that Ukrainian drones have broken the distance record? After all, as reported, the distance from the Ukrainian border to Berezniki is more than 1,500 kilometers in a straight line.
The record was set by drones from the main intelligence directorate of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, which struck an oil refinery in Ukhta. The distance from the notional Russian-Ukrainian border to the site of the strike is about 2,000 kilometers. 1,500 kilometers is a significant improvement in the tactical and technical characteristics of Ukrainian strike drones.
Meanwhile, during his speech at the Valdai Forum, Putin claimed that Russian occupiers had taken control of 2/3 of Kupiansk.
This is nothing more than an informational attempt to show, primarily to the domestic audience, that the Russian army supposedly has tactical advances along the entire front line. Moreover, Putin mentioned not only Kupiansk, but also accordingly the Pokrovsk direction, the Kostiantynivka direction, and Red Route. But there is not the slightest reason to talk about significant control over Kupiansk. Fighting is taking place in urban areas, but only on the outskirts of Kupiansk.
It seems that Russia will soon be left without electricity. The fact is that Washington has given the green light for American intelligence to share information with Ukraine about the locations of important energy facilities on Russian territory.
This is nothing more than an attempt by Western media to create an informational pretext. Let me emphasize once again, the United States has not stopped sharing intelligence with the Ukrainian side for a single day.
However, the question of supplying Tomahawks and other long-range missiles remains open as there is a risk of escalating the war.
We talked about long-range weapon systems. We'll see. Everything will depend on Donald Trump's decision. That's important.
For example, Mirage 2005 fighter jets could end up in Ukraine, but will it be soon? The US and NATO are putting pressure on Greece to provide more substantial military aid, for example, in the form of fighter jets rather than old equipment.
So far, this is not the most active country in Europe. Moreover, as a country that has gone through economic crises, Greece does not have the capacity to modernize its own army to deter external threats. And I want to emphasize once again, these are primarily unfriendly actions from Turkey. In other words, this is not the kind of European army that could provide real and significant, first and foremost, military assistance to the Ukrainian side.
But help is also rushing to Putin, and it seems with new arms supplies. It is reported that Russia and North Korea may have resumed deliveries after a 2-month break. This is indicated by images of a Russian vessel that was previously linked to illegal cargo from North Korea.
North Korea is primarily supplying artillery shells. And the means of destruction, this is South Oksan, Russian Federation Live Online. In fact, the deliveries have not stopped. It is precisely the transfer of North Korean shells that allows the Russian Federation to compensate, to a certain extent, for the shortage of artillery shells directly on the front line.
But apparently, inspired by the supplies from North Korea, even Tomahawk missiles no longer scare Putin. That's the kind of fable the bunker grandpa told at the Valdai Forum.
They are powerful and indeed posing a significant threat. Of course, this won't change anything. It absolutely won't change the overall balance on the entire battlefield at all.
Urgent apocalypse. Ukrainian drones are destroying the Kremlin's fuel system. Gasoline in Russia is on the verge of total annihilation. Russia is plunging into unprecedented chaos. Kilometer-long lines, panic, and riots at gas stations. Soon, cars will become a luxury for them. Watch for all the shocking details of the fuel catastrophe.
An absolute anti-record for Putin. Cars in Russia are ceasing to be a means of transportation and are turning into a luxury item. After all, it's becoming increasingly difficult for Russian citizens to fuel their iron horses. Despite the Kremlin extracting an enormous amount of oil, the country is facing a shortage of gasoline and diesel fuel. How
funny as it may seem, in a country that used to be a gas station, not only a raw materials appendage of China, an economy built on pipelines, now can't even provide its own population and businesses with oil and petroleum products.
The main culprit behind the catastrophic fuel shortage across the border has been the Ukrainian armed forces. Their precision strikes on the occupiers' oil refining infrastructure. So, by the end of September, oil refineries across Russia were idling at least 38% of their primary oil processing capacity. That's 338,000 tons per day. For a country that used to be a gas station, that's a colossal loss of market share. Recently, the fuel shortage has become a serious problem even at the front lines. At regular Russian gas stations, you can't find 95-octane fuel in most regions, even if you search high and low during the day.
At some individual gas stations, private owners started temporarily limiting the amount of fuel sold to each customer. In some places, they allowed sales of up to 20 liters, in others up to 30 liters. And at other gas stations in certain regions of Russia, they even temporarily suspended the sale of certain types of fuel altogether. That is, in some places there was no AI 92 gasoline available, in others there was no AI 95, and so on. At the same time, at small independent private gas stations that are not part of the so-called vertically integrated oil companies, there was a sharp increase in fuel prices.
The latest situation in the country has only made things worse. Along with the shortage at gas stations came sky-high prices. Over this summer, the price of gasoline and diesel in Russia has increased by a solid 15 to 20%. And starting from autumn, the prices on the signs at gas stations across the border have been changing almost daily, each time adding another ruble or so to the cost of fuel. But even such an increase is not enough to cover the costs of Russian oil refineries, which are now constantly under attack from Ukrainian drones.
The scale of the shortage is such that this is a desperate attempt by hitting the pockets of oilmen, of oil companies suffering disasters, whose profits are collapsing and many of whom have become unprofitable, to somehow supply the domestic market.
Things are even worse for Russian oil traders on foreign markets than they are domestically. If previously the state compensated for the price difference through exports, today Russian oil isn't being bought in Europe even for pennies, which means that cheap gasoline within Russia itself is no longer something to expect.
There's a big problem with fuel and the crisis will only get worse. Accordingly, oil companies can't make money on foreign markets because everything is tight, there are price caps and oil prices are falling. Right now, Russian oil is trading at about $55 to $57 per barrel, taking into account all the discounts and markdowns. And that's it. So now oil companies are basically begging the government for help, asking for lower taxes, reduced mineral extraction tax rates, export duties, and excise taxes. But the authorities can't do that. They have their own budget issues, they're facing a budget crunch.
How is the Russian economy supposed to patch this hole? There's nothing to do it with. As a result, the Kremlin couldn't come up with anything better than to announce the start of fuel imports into the country while simultaneously halting all exports of gasoline and diesel from Russia. So
basically, they decided to import gasoline. This is how Putin won. He used to say that Russia would not become a gas station. I think this is a real victory. We should really note that now Russia will be buying gasoline. How can you not recall Churchill, who said that when the Soviet Union starts buying wheat, that's when it will be finished. So, roughly speaking, when Putin's Russia starts buying gasoline, after a while it will come to an end, just like the Soviet Union once did.
The Ukrainian authorities have also actively set out to help bring about Russia's end, not only with drone attacks on oil refineries, but Kyiv is also hitting Putin's economy hard on the diplomatic front.
If Ukraine synchronizes its strategy to reduce Russia's resource base together with its allies, with Europe, with America, with Japan, and so on, then sanctions will be imposed very quickly, and even South Korea and Singapore will simply be afraid to supply gasoline to Russia for fear of falling under sanctions.
In such a desperate situation, the Kremlin is grasping at the last straw, disregarding all environmental standards. The government has practically legalized counterfeit products, hoping that at least this will saturate the Russian gasoline market. However, analysts insist that such a decision will, on the contrary, drive the final nail into the coffin, not only of oil refining in Russia, but beyond that as well.
The authorities have decided to tackle the gasoline shortage with methods that cause suffocation and damage car engines. Deputy Prime Minister Novak has proposed bringing back for 6 months a special gasoline additive that was banned back in 2016. They want to use it to increase gasoline production, but there's a catch. This additive has a negative impact on the environment, damages vehicles, and increases the amount of nitrogen oxides in exhaust fumes, which settle in the air about 60 centimeters above the ground. Breathing in these vapors is dangerous for people. Among the symptoms of poisoning are slowed reactions, suffocation, and bluish discoloration of the hands and ears.
And such a surrogate, such a toxic additive, can instantly turn an engine into a pile of scrap metal. After just 6 months of driving on this kind of fuel, a car will be ruined, as will all of Russia's public transport. Then, without proper gasoline and diesel, the entire multi-million-strong country would be forced to switch back to good old horse-drawn carts.
That's all for now. For more major breaking news from the front, tune in to our next episode.